The MPTF Media Center presents the international premiere podcast of Mystery Theater Audibles, Blackfire, a science fiction fantasy novel written and narrated by Anthony Lawrence, directed and produced by Madeline Smith Lawrence, produced by Jennifer Clymer, sound engineered by Marcus Murrieta.
Chapter 97. My inability to move lasted only moments. Then I exploded into a quick run toward those doors at the other end of the kitchen. It may have been quick, but it was unexpectedly short because I tripped over my own feet and went spread-eagled onto the floor. It was coming at me from all sides, and when I say it, I mean just that. It was big and bald and had Cupid doll lips, but the most terrifying sight was those arms and hands that appeared to come at me from every side. The massive, nearly 1 ton of whitewashed flesh had more than 2 arms like the rest of us. I couldn't exactly calculate just how many, but it was a lot. It was like some human-looking, gigantic, corpulent octopus with swirling white tentacles that ended in huge fists, and each one carried some kind of kitchen weapon intended solely for my destruction. Christ, it was the martial arts 18 arms of wushu in the kitchen. I'd worked my way through college doing dirty jobs in various kitchens, so even though I'd never seen a sous chef like this one, I was fairly familiar with some of the nasty cook's tools and cutlery coming at me. A Japanese scimitar knife held in one lardy fist sliced through the air uncomfortably close to my head, and then another chunky hand gripping a meat tenderizing pounder came crashing down toward me, barely missing and leaving a large crack in the granite of a preparation area and a smashed induction plate. It was followed by that familiar black meat cleaver held in still another clutching fist that flashed toward me and ended up with its blade ripping into the surface wood near the edge of the butcher block. I could hear all hell breaking loose as pots and pans went flying from Cupid doll lips, enormous rocking frame, and the flailing fire hose arms and hands that were seeking out my demise. A huge boiling hot ceramic tureen of soup stock must have been knocked over because I could hear the crash, see the jagged pieces and steam, and feel the heat as droplets stung my face. I could also see asparagus, bok choy, spicy cucumbers, and a variety of Asian stir-fry flying around me. I scrambled to my feet just as another beefy fist came at me with a 12-inch-long tenderizer injection needle. I yelled out in fear as I jerked away from the stabbing, bodiless hand, wrist, and fire hose arm, then fast-crawled across the floor just like any other scurrying vermin. I managed to scoot under a butcher block just as that Cupid-lipped horror's chalky face slowly lowered and leered at me, his obese body totally obscuring the entire other side of the butcher block beyond its stout legs. Those coal-black as night, football-shaped eyes with tiny explosions of energy particles glared at me, and I could feel hot breath exuding from between those red lips. I still had my revolver clutched in my hand as I let go with 2 blasts straight into that giant face. But just as I expected, the bullets had little effect and seemed to be absorbed right into that blubbery bulk without even a trace of indentation or blood. The great indomitable mass of flesh and fury was blocking my way out of the kitchen, and I could see a tangle of arms and fists curling and undulating in my direction. There were a curved boning knife and another fist gripping a high-carbon sabatier with light dancing off both blades. I could only imagine what else was on its way. They were slashing at my face and moving in for a killer's stroke. I was fucked. I was about to be boned, filleted, pulverized, and Christ knows what else. Then I saw the open door to what appeared to be a giant freezer or butchery. It was only a couple of feet away, and I had little choice at this point. It had a handle on the inside and what appeared to be some kind of locking device that was controlled from the outside. My only chance would be to get inside and try locking the door so it couldn't be opened from the outside. Okay, it was dumb and not a very practical choice considering I would probably freeze to death once inside, but it just might give me time to think of some alternatives. It's strange the things that reverberate through your head when death is staring you in the face. I'd looked into the dark holes of pistols, shotguns, and even a a variety of high-tech assault rifles, but I'd never feared anything as much as those ordinary culinary tools coming at me fast and furious. Yet here I was, remembering that first evening with Jordan when I'd cooked a meal with some common lying-around stuff I'd dug up in that hotel room. Sure, I was just showing off my inventiveness, but it was simple, beautiful, and she was everything I ever wanted in a woman. Now every goddamn chef's tool and cutlery in this fucking nightmare kitchen was out to get me, and I had to reconcile the fact that I would probably never see her again. But I wasn't giving up yet. No way, not yet. I darted into the freezer like a rabbit into its warren, grabbing the handle to shut it behind me. It was only seconds after that scimitar knife had come around for a second slash, this time slicing right through the front of my shirt and enough skin to cause me to wince in pain and leave a bloody laceration on my chest. But I had gotten into the freezer and the door had slammed shut, leaving me separated from the motherfucking impossible fat octopus trying to kill me. One of the last things I saw just before the darkness of that freezer closed in was a heavy chisel lying on the floor that might have been used for ice or bone sculpture, who knows. But I scooped it up and jammed the blade end into the locking device so it couldn't be opened from outside. I sat on the cold floor, trying to catch my breath and let my eyes get accustomed to the dark. I knew I had only eluded death temporarily, and that thought was reinforced by the sound of the obese creature's howls of frustration and the rapid, violent pounding on the freezer door. It was dark, cold, and there was definitely a sense of death in there. The first thing I could make out as my eyes adjusted were what appeared to be large vats of pickling brine that I remembered were used for curing meats. Then I began to see around me various butchery supplies, blood-dripping pans, knives, twine, skewers, and brine pumps. The place was almost medieval. The pounding on the huge door grew even louder, and I backed away from it as it vibrated from the severe beating it was taking. But as I moved backward in the dark, I bumped against something that seemed to give way as if it were hanging from the ceiling. I glanced up, and once again my whole body jerked and stiffened from the shock of what I was seeing. It was the bloody and eviscerated carcass of a woman hanging on a hook. Her clothing, once satin, velvet, and silk, was ripped and torn and stained with dried blood. I could see that it had been the fancy clothing of a hotel valet or concierge, and I knew instantly who it was. Her name was Samanya, and she had been one of the most gorgeous and elegant creatures I'd ever seen. Oren had told me that his wife had been just an ordinary woman with an obsession to be beautiful, and had obtained her wish at table 18. She had been transformed into a ravishing and exquisite woman, cold and imperious, but with an enchanting worldly charm that was both seductive and irresistible. Now she was little more than cold meat hanging in the darkness, a disemboweled and horrifying remnant of a once sublime woman. Why had she been killed? Why not some other meaningless nobody guessed? I had no answer. She had been gutted like a hunter's prey kill, her entrails and one leg entirely missing. I was sickened by the sight, but even more than that, I was filled with an even deeper terror and revulsion, as I knew now for certain just what the courses were at that demon feast. And I knew the door of that freezer was now being covered with impact bulges and was not going to hold for very much longer. Chapter 98. Cody had followed Charlie Famous through the casino lobby, not sure whether he should have laughed or cried. He had been frightened for some time, but he couldn't have escaped the feeling that he was like Dorothy being dropped into the land of Oz, and that he had been following Tick-Tock, that squat and rotund robot from those books his mom had read to him from the time he was a baby. He'd seen the Judy Garland movie, too, and knew one thing. This place was no Oz, but it was sure scary. This mechanical character that had been leading Cody around was more modern and certainly gave the impression, like Tick-Tock, that it had been operating on its own. But Cody still had thought it might be some kind of trick to fool him into letting down his guard. Cody was a pretty sophisticated 10-year-old, and he had grown up around casinos and Vegas magicians. He never knew his dad, but his mom was plenty smart, and she had taught him a lot about cards and card players, as well as watching out for the kind of characters hanging around casinos. She had passed on a somewhat cynical approach to life, which she continued to reinforce as a means of keeping him safe growing up in places that were inherently unstable and potentially dangerous. He missed having a father and a male role model. Cody knew instinctively what that meant and how important it was for him to have somebody beside his mom to look up to and make him feel safe no matter what. Strangely, the closest man to ever fill that need had been Rafe, even though Cody had only seen him for a moment when Rafe picked him up on the golf course and drove him to the infirmary. But it had left the young boy with an overwhelming sense of Rafe's kindness and concern, both for him and his mother. But Rafe, like his mom, was unavailable to him, so he simply had to use that cynicism and his own savvy intuition. This may be a pretty weird casino, he had thought, but it was still just a casino. Even the remotest familiarity was still somewhat comforting to Cody. But his mom had always reminded him to stick with the basics, stay alert, keep away from strangers, especially those who looked like they had been drinking. But she had always pointed out more than anything else that being around a lot of strangers was far better than being alone with one. So it didn't take Cody more than a second or two to recognize that the yowling, toothless man at table 18 was nobody he wanted to be alone with anytime soon. Cody took one look, and it was enough to scare him severely. He darted off like the proverbial deer caught in the headlights of an approaching truck. The peevish slot named Charlie Famous cried out with as much intensity as its digital voice could muster, "Cody, wait!" But Cody was moving fast and unaware that Charlie Famous was calling to him, or that two other people had spotted him running from the room where table 18 and the yowling master of cards were waiting. The other two were his mother and the priest, Father Matus. Chapter 99. All I could do was fast crawl backward across that icy floor through the darkness. The freezer door burst open like the top of a can of tuna being ripped away, and Cupid-doll Lips completely obscured the opening with his massive girth, and a flurry of white fire hose snaking arms and fists whirling about were coming at me with their assorted lethal cutlery. I was terrified and almost accepting of the awful fate that was only seconds away, but even in those dreadful moments, I could still somehow appreciate the monstrous beauty of that creature about to reduce me to what I had seen hanging in the dark from a hook. The chalky paint, fleshy surfaces with their swirls and flourishes of black calligraphy, and that bulk of plumpish fat with its tiny scarlet mouth had a kind of obscene magnificence. My God, this thing is about to cut me up into a 9-course dinner, and I'm thinking how glorious it is. I should be saying my fucking prayers. Well, I bumped against other hanging things in the dark and got just a glimpse of those who had earlier met the same fate as Samanya and as I was about to endure. But I wasn't thinking those carcasses were so beautiful. I was just experiencing the desperation of a man about to die and scrambling to somehow avoid those anaconda arms slithering along the beams of light that managed to squeeze past the imposing, paunchy chunk of flesh to which they belonged. But instead of the slicing impact of scimitar knives and the bite of cleavers, I was feeling those arms wrapped around me in some kind of preliminary deadly holding pattern. I think the malevolent chef's brain behind Cupid-doll Lips was delighting in just squeezing me to death like I was python prey. I felt my body being slowly compressed and my breath being cut off. And then I heard the strangest sounds. It was music, definitely music, and I recognized it. Strangers with familiar faces slowly locked their eyes on me. Is it the curse that drives them mad, or am I the one suffering? It was Social Jet Lag's killer lyrics. Where did they hide Dr. Jekyll? And along with the pulsing rap, I could feel something rattling in the pocket of my jacket. It felt like popcorn going off or Mexican jumping beans. For a moment, I thought Daniel's teeth had come alive and were doing some kind of lonely dance in my pocket. But then that part of my mind that was still functioning with some kind of logic understood that it was the ringtone. and vibrations of my iPhone. And there could only be one fool human calling me at a time like this. It had to be Oren. And I knew that if I was not to die today and in this moment, I somehow needed to answer that phone. But both arms were constricted against my body and locked in the embrace of those wraparound fire hoses. I could barely move as I was being slowly crushed. I could only barely get one hand into my jacket pocket and use my fingers to try and turn on the iPhone. Somehow I must have touched the right spot because I could suddenly hear Oren's voice coming from my pocket. He sounded weak and the words were fractured, but I could just make out the gist of it. Hey, use the opal. The opal. The opal, I thought. The hell good would the opal do me now? I was dying. How could I even reach it? But Oren knew everything, right? I had to trust what he was telling me. I wasn't sure the opal was in the same pocket as the phone, but my fingers felt around and touched the smooth surface of the jewel. I couldn't breathe. I was smothering and being crushed. Survive. Survive. That's all you need to do. I stretched as far as I could and somehow clasped that stone between my fingers and juggled it into my palm, slowly bringing it out of my pocket. The room was spinning around and I felt vertigo overwhelming me and taking me down toward unconsciousness and death. But as I brought the stone upward by bending my elbow and thrusting it toward the monster that was crushing me, I felt a strange heat within it. The opal was definitely growing hot inside my grasp, as if it were picking up the intensity of my thought and my will. The last thing I saw was a thin line of black fire streak from the stone in a burning laser that burrowed into the fleshy forehead of Cupidol Lips. The tiny red bow at his mouth stretched and smeared as if an invisible hand had defaced its beauty. The mouth opened, and I saw the pointy yellow fangs and its vile throat. His great black eyes widened in shock, and the ghastly arms retreated instantly and wildly flailed against the light from the kitchen. But Cupidol Lips wasn't the only one dying, because my world kept spinning around and around, and the vertigo was taking me down. Chapter 100. Cody wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew that he couldn't have stayed where he was. Maybe he had made a mistake running away. Maybe Charlie Famous was telling him the truth about meeting his mother. But he just couldn't stay there and face that strange man with no teeth who was yowling and frothing at the mouth like some rabid dog. Cody darted around a couple who seemed either drunk or just tired as they made their way toward the nearest casino. As he glanced back through the large lobby with just a few people interrupting his view, Cody could have sworn he saw Father Matus. It was just a glimpse, but he was sure it was the priest. A screaming, toothless man was bad enough, but there was something even more dangerous about the priest, and Cody knew he must avoid him at all costs. Alarm bells were going off, and he ducked down a narrow corridor off the main lobby. He noticed a door that indicated it was a storage room, and he quickly tried the handle and discovered it was not locked. Cody had found refuge in many other storage rooms in other casinos when his mother was at work, and he had to kill time until she was off duty. Storage rooms always made good hideouts when you were playing cowboys or Star Wars, or just looking for a place to hunker down for a while and eat your candy bar. He quickly shut the door behind him and looked for the darkest and most remote spot inside the room. Like most storage rooms of this type, it contained a lot of cleaning equipment where staff workers could find whatever they needed. There were scrubbers and buffers, extractors and steam cleaners. There were stacked shelves of supplies for restrooms. But best of all, there were plenty of dark corners where Cody could hide. He found a spot behind a large trot mop wet vacuum with squeegees, and he hunkered down until he felt confident that he couldn't be seen even if the light were turned on. At least he hoped he couldn't. He tried to slow and quiet his breathing so that he couldn't be heard if someone came in. Then Cody noticed a small Pomo dream catcher sitting on a shelf nearby, a handmade Native American object based on a willow hoop, on which is woven a loose net or web and decorated with personal and sacred items such as feathers and beads. To some, it was a good luck charm, so Cody wasn't surprised to find it in a casino, even one as strange as this one. But to others, as Cody recalled reading in a book on Native American history at school, it provided spiritual protection from evil spirits. If Cody was ever in need of protection, it was now. He reached out, grabbed the dream catcher, and slipped it into his pocket. Moments passed, and then the door handle squeaked, as if it was being turned slowly. Cody froze in the darkness, somehow knowing it was the priest. The door opened in a way that no janitor would open it, very slow and stealthily. A large shadow loomed up in the light from the corridor. The shadow moved slowly into the room, and the door closed behind it. A moment went by, and then the light snapped on. Cody could see the priest from where he was hiding. The man had an even stranger look in his eyes than he had the last time Cody was in his presence. They had the same piercing quality, but there was a new and almost gleaming kind of wildness in them. The expression on his face sent chills through Cody's body, and he pressed himself further back into the darkness. Come out, wherever you are," crooned the priest in a lilting whisper. The priest's gravelly undertones and the slight twisted grin on his lips was terrifying to Cody. Father Matus moved slowly forward into the room, his eyes peering into the dark corners. Cody tried to compress himself into a ball to avoid those eyes, but they seemed to seek out his hiding place, and the fear once again began to rise in him. It was only a matter of seconds before the priest would find him. What could he do? Cody slowly reached out toward a mop handle that was leaning against the trot vacuum close to him. He gripped the handle with both hands, and just as the priest moved close to him, Cody exploded out of the corner and jammed the mop handle tip into Father Matus's stomach. The priest grunted in pain from the impact, but was not enough to prevent him from grabbing Cody by his jacket. At the same time, he ripped the mop away from the boy and threw it off to the side. Cody began to yell and struggle, the priest quickly clapping his palm over the boy's mouth to silence him. Cody felt that he was about to die, and he had no idea that what he was facing would be worse than death. He tried to extricate himself, but the priest was young and strong, held him fast in his arms. The child's body felt good to the priest, and he was bursting with desire. But suddenly the door to the storage room flew open, and Jordan stood there, her face enraged, and her hand holding the revolver that Oren had given her earlier. It was leveled at the priest's head. "Take your goddamn hands off my son." Her voice was low but hard-edged and filled with loathing. The priest stared at her, startled, but held Cody tightly in front of him. Father Matus stared at Jordan for a moment with utter fascination, knowing that she had risen from the dead. "You killed me," said Jordan bitterly. "Yes," he responded with a thin, ironic smile. "But I suppose if youth could be restored, then so could life. Let go of him." The priest's face took on a pouting, hurt look. "Crude and ungrateful you are, Jordan. You should thank me for winning back your son's life." Jordan's face tightened, and she jerked the gun meaningfully at the priest. "You sick motherfucker. You did it to have him. Let him go now, or you'll find out just what dying feels like." But the priest continued to shield himself with Cody's body. "Suffer the little children, and forbid them not to come unto me," the priest intoned softly, his eyes reflecting the rising madness that was overcoming him. "For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." His hand was still locked over the boy's mouth, but he suddenly reacted in pain as Cody bit hard into the palm of his hand. "Mom!" Cody screamed and struggled to get free, but the priest held him and then slapped him hard in response to the painful bite. It was then that Jordan fired the gun, and the bullet tore a hole through Father Matus's neck. He reacted in shock and horror, grabbing at the lacerated hole as he began to strangle and gyrate backward from the force of the bullet. Jordan charged forward and grabbed Cody, pulling him away from the priest, who collapsed on the floor. He writhed in agony as he quickly suffocated in the flow of his own blood. Jordan held her son tightly against her, turning his head away from the sight of the man convulsing on the floor. In seconds, the priest was still, but something else was occurring that caused Jordan to stare at his wretched and contorted face. She watched in amazement as the man's youthfulness faded away in the same way that life itself was undergoing transformation. Jordan knew by now that death was not necessarily a permanent condition, but seeing the metamorphosis occurring on the floor of the storage room was both startling and incomprehensible. Father Matus not only seemed to be going through the death experience, but his face was aging just as swiftly. A series of lines and wrinkles scarred his entire countenance, and his hair turned white as snow. But something else was happening. The priest was becoming transparent. And then he completely disappeared. In an instant, he had vanished from sight. Jordan and Cody stared at the empty place on the floor where Father Matus had been lying in a pool of blood. There was no sign of the man and no trace of blood on the floor. Then the pair reacted to something else that drew their attention. Charlie Famous stood in the doorway. The slot's LCD screen was alive with explosive lights, and its digital monotone voice echoed in the small storage room. "Daniel wants to see you now." Chapter 101. One minute I was in Hell's Kitchen being crushed to death by Cupid-doll lips, and then the next I was in Oren's hotel suite. It was like waking up from a nightmare, the only difference being that I was standing up instead of lying in some bed. I wasn't exactly steady on my feet because I was still feeling the effects of the vertigo that was the byproduct of moving through space in an instant. I took a long breath and felt my body to be sure I was really still alive. You can never be sure around here. There was excruciating pain in my back and rib cage, and the muscles in my neck were sore. But despite the mangling I'd received from the tank with many arms, I didn't appear to be busted up inside. In fact, the pain and the opal that I still held in my hand confirmed that what I'd experienced was no dream. It had been real, and I'd felt what it was like to be in a meat grinder. Strange that there was some comfort in knowing it was real, even though I still had no idea what Cupid-doll lips was, or for that matter, what the fuck those things were who were having an unusual breakfast in that dining room. I heard a sound close by and saw Oren lying spread out on the heavy shag rug that covered the floor of his suite. I stared at him in utter disbelief. The skin on his face, arms, and hands had changed even more, almost incandescent, but not entirely robotic-looking, with tiny flashes of lights sparking from some unseen force within. It was like staring down at the bioluminescence of some living organism rising from the dark ocean depths. Oren had a bottle of gin clutched in his hand as usual, and he seemed to really be struggling to maintain consciousness. His eyes were glassy, and he reached out to me with one hand, palm open, and I could hear him forming the words, "Give it to me." I glanced down at the Blackfire opal in my hand, and I could still feel its powerful heat. I had a moment of hesitation, as if giving up the jewel was like forfeiting a prize that I had nearly died obtaining. But I was well aware that Oren was the only person I could trust who would know what to do with it. He had trusted me and assigned the mission to me, and I felt a slight bit of pride that I had accomplished it. I held out the jewel to place it in his palm, and I could see my own hand still trembling as the fear and exhaustion continued to sweep over me. Oren's glassy eyes focused on the jewel as I placed it in his hand. He closed his fingers around it as if allowing its heat to penetrate into his changing skin and to circulate. I could see a thin smile spread across his lips, and he stared up at me. "Thank you, Rafe. I knew you could do it." Sure, no problem." I managed a sardonic grin as I crouched down beside him. But I was shaking badly, and for the moment I just wanted him to ask me if I was all right. The strange little man had become something of a father figure, and I really wanted him to care about me. But Oren hardly ever asked a question, any question, because he always seemed to know the answers. Even now he knew the questions that I was about to ask. He clutched the opal to his breast as he managed to pull himself into a sitting position and take another swig from the bottle of gin. Then he placed the gemstone on the carpet and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "There are people," he began slowly, "who, according to legend, call to demons or malignant spirits with their thigh-bone trumpets, offering the hungry ghosts the scent of burning foods and feeding them with their bodies that have transformed into pure nectar." Oren shrugged. It's a Tibetan thing, supposedly allegorical, and has to do with possessing the minds of beings in the human realm. What you did was to see the cooking and offering at a banquet to an assembly of demons, spirits, and sentient beings. No, don't even try to understand it, Rafe. It's just part of what has always existed and still exists. The Red Feast for the beings who are very angry and malicious. What attacked you in the kitchen was somewhat different. It was a tatui. A what? A tatui. A living, gluttonous ogre, one of the 4 evil creatures of the world who lived during the time of the legendary Yellow Emperor in China. What do you mean, lived? It's fucking still here. Everything still exists, Rafe. Everything. Remember, I told you, every single creature who ever lived, real or legendary, every thought, every literary creation, you've seen it in different realms or cosmic patches, according to science with its structures, abstractions, and processes or metaphysics, as in the words of Rinpoche. It's the same with dark and light and gods and demons. Oh, I've tried to tell you that. Yes, I know. I know you saw my dear wife, Leona, in the freezer. But death isn't absolute finality. She still exists. The simple girl of my youth, with shining corn silk hair and the gentle touch. The one I forgave so long ago for all her failings and narcissism. The energy of each human, a permanent atom, endures. We arise in the bardos, Chads say, with a mental body that can experience a great deal of suffering if it is confused and stuck. Even he still exists. Oren slowly pointed toward another part of the room, and I could see the supine form of a man lying crumpled and still in death. He was covered with blood. I didn't recognize him at first. It's Father Matus, Rafe. He's dead, but he still exists. He's on the path of transformation. But I now have the means to end his existence, along with Daniel and this whole horrible and bizarro world he created. I wanted you to see the priest so that you would know you needn't pursue that quest any longer. Jordan shot him with a gun I provided her. Jordan? I stared at the priest's body with a mixture of disbelief and deep sense of bitter frustration. I wanted to end his life myself somehow. And now he was finally gone. But Oren had said that he wasn't really dead. He still existed. Oh, there's a difference between death and existence, Rafe. Oren seemed to be reading my mind. Maybe it was, what did he call it? The third eye that was contained in the opal that was actually giving him that power. I had no idea. I only knew that I was overwhelmed and still filled with cynicism and skeptical of all he was saying. I'd seen so much and experienced so much, but I still couldn't seem to accept his ideas about reality. I know you wanted to ask me about Jordan and her son. Oh, they're still in danger, Rafe. I'd like to help them, but I must use the power of the opal first against Daniel. Now, you've learned how to use the action potential in your brain so that you have an even better chance to help them. Go now and do what you can. No, Oren, wait. There's no time, he said. And I could tell that he was losing his grip on his own life. I didn't quite get what he said next any more than anything else he had been saying, but I knew from things he had said earlier that he related very much to the figure of Job in the Bible. There was a man in the land of Uz, so upright and feared of God, he prayed to turn from evil in all his thought. But arrows from an almighty bow impaled his heart, and his spirit ebbed with guilt and implication. Goodbye, Rafe. Chapter 102. They followed Charlie Famous through the lobby. The portable slot was leading them toward table 18, and Daniel, who was apparently waiting for them. Jordan and Cody didn't want to go, but some unseen force was controlling them that was irresistible and exceeded any capability to direct their own lives. And something peculiar was actually happening to Charlie Famous as well. The machine was leading the pair toward the Master of Cards, but some internal conflict was causing it to move in an erratic manner. Its digital light screen was bursting with a strange array of activity, and there was a whirring of some inner whistles and irritable bongs that Cody had not heard before. The one-armed bandit also appeared to be gyrating somewhat unsteadily in its course across the lobby. Cody stared curiously at the machine. He was beginning to suspect that Charlie Famous just might be a little more similar to the boy's memory of Oz's tick-tock than he might previously have imagined. It happened as they reached the closed door to the Table 18 room. The huge door opened slowly by itself, and Jordan walked into the room as if in a trance. Something was drawing her inside, and she was unable to prevent it. Cody felt the power pulling on him as well, but his forward movement was suddenly interrupted by a hand that grabbed his wrist and prevented him from entering the room. Cody glanced down and at first thought it might be the hand of some unknown stranger, but was stunned as he realized the hand gripping his wrist belonged to Charlie Famous. Cody had been around casinos long enough to know full well that the single-sided knobby levers that were still a part of most modern slots were just traditional leftovers and really served no purpose other than for people to use who were just in the long-time habit of yanking them down. The machines had some while ago been digitally converted and were operated by keys or buttons and didn't even spill real coins into their trays. They delivered the sound of coins, but it was simply an illusion, and all you really got was a small card that displayed your winnings and entitled you to further action on any other machines as well. But the once metal lever that extruded from this one-armed bandit was something Cody could hardly believe. It was a real human arm and hand that was connected to the machine at the shoulder in some indefinable way. It had magically transformed itself from a metal lever into a flesh and blood arm and hand, and was now reaching down and holding Cody back from entering the room after his mother. The boy was startled, to say the least, and his instinct was to try and pull away from the grasp of the grotesque cyborg arm and hand that was holding him. But the grip was firm, and the lights on Charlie Famous's light screen were bursting with a wild constellation of colors and graphics. "You're not going in there, Cody," said Charlie Famous in a series of uneven digital voice activations that reflected its inner struggle. "I'm going to help you." Cody stared wide-eyed up at the machine, at its mad, colorful display, and at its incredible human arm and hand that was holding him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and yet he knew intuitively that Charlie Famous was somehow fighting against his own uncommon programming in an effort to aid Cody. As the immense door to the room closed, leaving Cody and Charlie just outside the room, The boy had an immediate reaction to being separated once again from his mother. "Mom!" he cried out, but Charlie held him fast, and the digital voice was a machine-like simulation of a confidential whisper, but definite and reassuring. "It's all right, Cody. Come with me." Chapter 103. I was now completely alone in Oren's suite. In an instant, both he and the body of the priest had vanished. I had no idea where they had gone or just exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew that I had to find Jordan and Cody. I had been about to ask Oren where they might be, but I figured that if he had wanted or had been able to tell me, he certainly would have. I quickly realized that whatever I was going to do, I'd better do it damn fast, because I was sure from what Oren had been saying that he had a plan to knock down this house of cards, and it was going to happen soon. Just what that was, I didn't have a clue, but I was sure it had something to do with the Blackfire opal that was now in his possession thanks to me. I was on my own, and I had to somehow put all that had been happening to me out of my mind. I was still shaking and in a lot of pain from my bout with the Cupid-doll-lipped gluttonous ogre in the impossibly strange and dangerous kitchen. I just had to suck it up and get moving. I charged to the front door of the suite and ran out into the hall, made my way to the elevator and descended to the lobby. There was only one real way to find Jordan and Cody. They must have been still around, where I believed Oren would have told me. I made my way directly toward table 18. I had last seen Daniel standing in his bedroom down below the resort just after I had relieved him of his teeth and the opal. He was a creepy sight with his toothless mouth opened wide and that vile howl following me out the door. Maybe he was still down there, but I somehow felt he was waiting for me at table 18. It was more than a feeling. I was being compelled to go there. I was being drawn there just as if there were some invisible cord attached to my head pulling me. I reached under my jacket and felt for my service revolver, knowing at the same time that it wasn't going to be worth shit in the long run. For a moment, as I was inexorably drawn toward the room with that massive carved table 18, I was distracted by a commotion at the far end of the room and a woman's scream. I couldn't quite make it out, but she seemed to be screaming something about a machine with a human arm. I put it down to her being an early drinker and continued on my way. Not that I had any real choice. Something I couldn't resist was pulling me toward the room, and I had little doubt just who or what that might be. The huge door to the room opened slightly as I drew near, and I was drawn inside. My hand was still gripping the Glock 22 in my holster, but I held out little hope that it would be of any real help in the coming encounter. It was just as I remembered it, a great carved ancient poker table dominating the room, and there were just two people standing on the far side. I was instantly relieved to see that one of them was Jordan, though the way she was positioned next to Daniel and the expression on her face made my stomach sink. I knew she was being held there by the same force commanded by Daniel that had brought me here. There was no sign of Cody, and that worried me a lot, although I knew I could do nothing about that unless and until I took care of the immediate problem. I had a hell of a lot of doubt about that. The force that had been propelling my forward motion slowly diffused, and I took a deep breath of relief as I faced Daniel. His eyes were extremely black and fierce as they stared at me. His mouth worked in an almost obscene effort to get the words out, his incomplete jaw dropping lower than normal, leaving what seemed to be just an irregular sunken orifice, like a small black cavern that stretched and contorted. One of his hands was reaching out toward me with its palm up. "Give it back." The sound of his voice was like something vile and unearthly, and it made my knees quake. But I put up my best service front and slipped out the revolver. I leveled it right at that ghastly hole in his face. I figured he was the master of cards, but I was going to make a kind of last-stand bluff in the best way I knew how. "Let her go," I demanded. "Give it back," he insisted with that weird, hollow voice. I was pissed and not about to back down. I reached into my pocket and scooped up the loose collection of his teeth. With a quick, smooth, but dismissive gesture, I threw them across the tabletop like a set of dice. "You can have these back." They bounced and rolled for a moment, then stunned me somewhat as they suddenly arced up off the table en masse and reset themselves correctly and automatically in his open maw. The smile that ensued with those reset, brilliant white teeth was awesome and terrifying. Now when he spoke, his voice was as I remembered it, still deep and hollow, but more human and a little less frightening. But to tell the truth, I was still near shitting my pants. I had no idea what I would do next. "Did you give the opal to Oren?" Daniel asked darkly. I hesitated for a moment and then simply nodded. His face turned ashen and his eyes flared with some fiery energy. But the brilliant white smile and the nasty curve of his lips remained. "Then I will have to punish Jordan, won't I?" Daniel turned slowly toward Jordan and waved his hand at her. She screamed as if sudden pain, so I fired the Glock 22 directly at his head.